The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Dr. Benny Peiser, director at the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Today's topic is climate change and global policy. And Dr. Peiser, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the foundation and your work there, because it's very important what you're doing.
Yeah, well, the Global Warming Policy Foundation was founded in 2009 in the run-up to the Copenhagen UN Climate Summit. The founder was Nigel Lawson, the former chancellor under Margaret Thatcher, who was her chancellor for 11 years, and perhaps the most successful chancellor in post-war Britain. He founded this foundation because he was concerned that most governments who signed up to the climate agenda had never actually calculated what it would cost them. And he realized that the environment ministers were signing up to all these agreements, and the finance ministers had no idea what the implications would be in the end. And that was his main concern. And we are a educational think tank. So we produce papers, reports in order to encourage scrutiny and discussion about the policies adopted by governments, mainly in Western nations, to tackle climate change.
You know, you travel the world. We saw you here in Central Virginia not long ago, and I know you have an upcoming trip, I believe, to Australia. So you're all over the place. I'd like for you to talk about, in a broad sense, the battle that we're in, because I certainly see this as a battle for the truth and really a battle for the future of the planet.
Well, it would be nice if it were a battle. In most of Europe, there isn't a battle. There is an all-party consensus that this is the most important priority for governments, or it used to be up until fairly recently, the most important priority, tackling climate change. And of course, the big question is an intellectual one. What are the best ways and the most cost-effective ways of dealing with climate change? And that is the real intellectual battle, which is much more difficult in Europe than perhaps in the US, where you have a partisan divide on this. In Europe, most parties think that the only solution is going for renewable energy, and they think that renewable energy will solve this problem.
Is the issue here that the opposition has been squashed, or is that there is no opposition to speak of?
No, the problem is that the governments and the mainstream media, plus the scientific institutions, including most universities, have essentially shut down any proper debate on these issues. So there is opposition, but it is marginalized, and it's not being allowed to actually articulate itself properly or scrutinizing the current policies. So, but the opposition to the current kind of net zero agenda is marginalized, is fairly small, although the public is beginning to become increasingly concerned about the cost and the burden they are facing as a direct result of these policies.
Are there pushes in Europe, as there are here in the United States, to either criminalize or stigmatize so-called climate change deniers?
Well, stigmatize and censor, definitely, on social media, but also in most institutions, including the public institutions and public radio and television like the BBC. This has been going on for many, many years. And of course, it's always about the claim that people are denying climate change or anthropogenic climate change. Our main objective is to actually scrutinize the policies and the costs of the policies being adopted, and also scrutinize the kind of more alarmist claims and predictions that are being made kind of habitually. But as you said, there are very, very strong efforts to shut down any critical voices. And here in Europe, that has been fairly successful. On the other hand, there is a growing kind of political opposition because of the rising costs. So there's a discrepancy between what the officials are trying to clamp down on and the rising opposition to these policies.
I'd like to go specifically now to some of the countries in Europe because they have taken some level of individual paths here. And let's start with Germany, which was, I think at some point, a poster child for how things were supposed to be. Tell us about the path that Germany's been on and where it has led.
Yes. So Germany obviously is ground zero for most of these climate policies. One of the first countries to essentially phase out nuclear energy because of the green movement and the opposition to nuclear energy, and becoming, as a result, increasingly reliant on Russian energy imports. Germany today is almost completely reliant on Russian oil, gas, and coal imports to more than 50% of their energy consumption. And because of the war in the Ukraine and the decision to phase out nuclear energy, the German government, which now includes the Green Party, have decided that they will go back to burning more coal. So the solution for the German government, who have been banging on climate change for the last 30 years, is actually to return to burning more coal. They are saying it's only temporary, but given that they are shutting down the last 3 nuclear power plants at the end of the year, it's almost inevitable that they will be burning coal for at least the next 20 years.
So we hear a lot about the return to coal in some places. Some, of course, have never left it. But are these the construction of new plants? I'm just curious, did they keep the old coal-fired plants in mothballs, so to speak, and then they're bringing them back? What's happening?
Yeah, well, obviously, Germany still is 40% of their energy or electricity mix is coal. So it's they're extending the life of coal power plants, and they're bringing back some mothballed old coal power plants. It's a combination, and you will see that happening in a number of European countries as the gas price has risen quite dramatically. It's now 10 times higher than the gas price in the US, just to give an idea of just how expensive it is.
Let's go on to the United Kingdom, and there's a lot of interesting things happening there. I want to start with the availability of natural resources because it is a resource-rich nation, but there are some problems in obtaining those resources.
That's right. I mean, Britain is basically a piece of land sitting on huge reserves of coal and natural gas. I mean, a few years ago, offshore coal was discovered, 1 to 23 trillion tons of coal in the North Sea, which would last essentially for 1,000 years if it were to be extracted. And the same with shale gas, huge shale deposits in the north of the country, perhaps enough gas to power Britain for 50 years, perhaps 100 years. So, and the same is true for other European countries. But basically, what we're seeing is these countries are unwilling to extract domestic resources. They rely on imports from Russia and the Middle East primarily because they don't want to get their hands dirty, and they think it looks better if you import it. Never mind the carbon footprint of importing this stuff. Mm-hmm. But Europe is actually sitting on huge amounts of resources, mainly natural gas and coal, which I expect to be used more in the next few years, perhaps decades, than before, just to get off the dependence on Russian imports.
Is that because of a political change of heart, or is there some realism as to what's actually going on that's moving this change?
No, there's no realism. It's just the energy costs are going through the roof. And it's not only damaging households and impoverishing millions of households, but it's also threatening industry. Essentially, they can't afford their energy costs anymore, and they're facing shutdown as well, and the stability of the national electricity grids as well. So we're far from politicians acknowledging that there is a real discrepancy between their net zero agenda and the energy crisis. Whatever they are doing now, going more for domestic fossil fuels, will be sold as a temporary cluster. Of course, within a few years, most of these governments won't be in power anymore, and a new generation of politicians and ministers will have to reassess what is more important: energy security, national security, or their green agenda.
You mentioned the prices skyrocketing, and when you were visiting us here, you told us some numbers which are almost hard to fathom. What's actually happening with the price of energy in Britain?
Well, the energy bills have just gone up by nearly 100% compared to about 12 months ago. I think 80%. So they used to be around £1,000 and now around £2,000. They might go up to £3,000 by the end of the year. And there are reports now saying that if the war in the Ukraine goes on for much longer and there's a real kind of political crisis with Russia, and they might, shut down or curtail the gas supplies to Europe, it might go up to £5,000. So we are talking costs that are unaffordable for roughly a quarter of the British public. So about 25% of UK households by the end of this year will be unable to pay their energy bills. And no one knows what's going to happen when, that many consumers can't pay their bills, and, energy suppliers will face bankruptcy, essentially.
I'm not sure a lot of people understand what it means when people can't heat their homes. There's certainly an increase in deaths and other problems societally. So is the government going to step in and say, we'll pay for it now as just part of a social program? I mean, how do they handle this widespread poverty?
Well, for the time being, they have timed it to spring so that, the energy bills are not as high as in the winter. But come next winter, as I said, it will be very difficult to compensate millions and tens of millions of families. The government currently is, I think, offering poor families something like £200. But if energy prices rise by £800, then even £200 won't make much of a difference. Never mind if they're going to increase by another £800 by the end of the year. So it will be very difficult. There is, of course, the prospect that the government may have to completely nationalize the energy sector, and we're going to kind of energy socialism in Britain and some other European countries. And of course, we know how that ends.
Well, we certainly do. I want to go to one more European nation very specifically, which is France, who has been reliant on nuclear power, more so than any other nation, perhaps. Tell us what the story is in France and how that's working for them presently.
Well, 70% of electricity generated in France is from nuclear energy. That makes France much more resilient and independent of these kind of international crises. So their energy prices have gone up by 4%.
Wow.
Instead of 80%. So you can see there's a dramatic difference, and it's not surprising. So they have that advantage compared to Germany, that who have shut down nuclear and are now completely dependent on Russia and the high gas and coal prices. So they have that advantage, and I expect a nuclear renaissance in Europe. But that takes, a very long time, years, if not decades, to build a new fleet of nuclear power plants. Even France has announced that they want to build some new ones, and Boris Johnson has announced they want to build 7, 8 new ones, but that might be by 2050.
There is a great fear among some of nuclear energy, although it is a very clean source of power, generally speaking. How do we address the people who are fearful because of accidents, things like Chernobyl or Fukushima?
Yeah, well, that you have to basically tell them, what are you more afraid? Freezing in the winter or having the potential risk of a nuclear power plant in your country? Given the track record, you have to, I mean, very often rational arguments do not overcome emotional fear. That is very difficult. But if you tell them, look at the people who have died in the last 50 years from coal power plants or from gas power plants or from nuclear power plants or from any other way of generating electricity, dams, hydro dams, and so on, then nuclear has a very, very good track record. But these arguments, these very rational arguments, don't seem to work with people with irrational fears. The only way to reach people with irrational fears is to confront them with different forms of fear. And then you have to tell them, if you have to weigh up that you want high energy bills and freezing temperatures in your home in the winter, or you want a reliable source of energy that comes with the low risk of a nuclear power plant. So that's the only way to deal with irrational fears, is that people have to weigh up which is the more. And, in Germany, as I said, the irrational fear of nuclear actually overwhelmed the irrational fear of climate change, because the companies were saying, look, this is zero carbon power. This is the best way of generating an industrial country with electricity that doesn't emit any CO2. And still the Greens feared nuclear more than climate change.
What are the advances in nuclear power and nuclear power technology and safety? Because obviously here in the United States, most of our plants are a generation or two behind. What's the latest?
Well, obviously, you have the kind of European nuclear power plants. The problem isn't so much security. They are all very, very secure. And there have never been any significant disasters or problems at all in Europe. The Russian one, Chernobyl, was an old banger that wasn't really well developed. The prototype was very poor, and the standards were very poor, which is what you expect from socialism. But in Europe, there have never been any real problems. The problem is mainly economic. These huge power plants are very, very expensive to build, and it takes a long time. The new development, and perhaps the most promising development in nuclear technologies, are the small modular reactors. These are small reactors that are much smaller, much cheaper, and more safe in many respects. We don't know exactly when they will be developed and ready to be deployed, but there is hope that at the end of this decade, there might be the first ones to be deployed. And that might be the nuclear breakthrough we need to make nuclear economic. That is the biggest challenge. I don't think there's a real big environmental risk. I think that has always been overplayed and exaggerated. I think it's an economic and technological challenge, mainly.
When you say small, give us a sense. I grew up in the shadow of the San Onofre power plants in Southern California. When I was a kid, we used to go swimming in the ocean and notice that the water was a little warmer, and we kind of enjoyed that. But these new small and modular plants, what are they like?
What are they like? Well, they are generating much less electricity than the big ones. Are much easier. You can essentially produce them in factories. The big ones, you have to create and produce on site. It takes ages, years and years, sometimes up to 10 years to build them. These smaller modular reactors can be built in factories and can be, they could sit anywhere near a town, a city, or an industrial hub. Just like many hospitals have small nuclear reactors, subs have small nuclear reactors. So we have already experience with small nuclear reactors that power submarines or even some hospitals. So, just expand that a little bit, and then you have the small modular reactor.
I'd like to go to the United States now, Dr. Peiser, and talk about some of the policies happening here, or at least the push for them. In particular, I'd like to start with wind power here in Virginia. They're talking about putting massive wind farms out off the coast. Is wind a reliable alternative to traditional power generation?
Unfortunately, it isn't. And that's what many European countries are now experiencing. Wind is highly intermittent. In other words, it blows some days, in other days it doesn't generate any electricity. It needs to be backed up by conventional power plants, which make wind very expensive. So wind, no matter how many million wind turbines you build, if the wind doesn't blow, it's not a question of how many wind turbines there are. Even a million wind turbines don't work if there is no wind. That's the experience we've had here and we're having in Europe when we have prolonged periods of low or no wind, which means that you basically need a second system of electricity backup that can power an industrial society like Britain or the US. Now, people are saying, okay, we get that. That is very expensive to have basically two. You need two electricity systems. One is renewable and one that generates the power when there aren't, when there isn't sun or when there's no wind. So they're saying we're going for batteries, but it's now becoming quite obvious that you cannot build large enough batteries to actually store enough energy for those periods without renewable energy. It's just too astronomical in terms of cost and in terms of technological advancement. And so we are beginning to realize that renewables, instead of being the solution to global warming, is actually part of the problem, is actually making things worse rather than better.
There was a story here in the national news that the federal government, which has been encouraging wind farms, is now fining some of the wind farm producers for killing bald eagles, of course, a protected species here. But what are the environmental impacts that we're not hearing about regarding these big wind turbines?
Yeah, absolutely. There are quite a number of case studies of these wind turbines. They kill a lot of birds. And if you have, eagles or other very important species around, they will kill them, or bats. They kill these birds in the thousands. People are saying, so what? I mean, cats kill birds. But the environmental impact is on a number of issues. It's not just that they kill wildlife and birds. It's also the environmental footprint is, 100 times bigger than conventional forms of energy generation. So a single gas-fired power plant only needs very little space and only destroys very little agricultural land and has a very limited impact on the, on the environment and on the countryside. But 1,000 wind turbines or more will be spread all over the place. So the environmental footprint of these renewables is 100-fold because they need so much space. And that also goes for solar panels that take away a lot of agricultural land. And we talk about ethanol as well, which increases food prices. So they all have environmental and social negative implications and impacts that most people either don't know or ignore. And you have to, when you look at energy, you have to weigh up the pros and the cons, and most people are not aware of the many negatives of renewable energy, including that they are unreliable, costly, and really not solving the problem of intermittency.
We should talk a little bit more about the problems with solar. Again, it's being sold here in this community as safe, clean, effective replacement for traditional power generation. Where are these panels coming from primarily, and what happens to them at end of life?
Well, it's good questions. They come primarily from China, obviously, because they can produce solar panels for half or even less the cost of solar panels produced in the US. I think there has been a big row over Chinese solar panels and whether they should be taxed more or banned or whatever. But obviously, the Chinese are subsidizing the production of solar panels and wind farms in a huge way, not least because they're using very cheap energy, mainly coal, to produce them. And of course, again, as you said, there will be a tremendous environmental problem once solar panels will have to be replaced. And no one knows. There are a lot of toxic materials in them, how to recycle them. It will be a very big, challenging task for years to come. It will be an avalanche of millions and tens of millions of old solar panels that will have to be recycled one way or another, which is a huge, and never mind the electric batteries, where we have the same problem. We don't know yet how to recycle old, the batteries for electric vehicles. Big environmental change. I'm not questioning that you can solve that, but it will be very costly. No one takes these costs into consideration.
You were discussing the battery technology presently existing, and I was reading yesterday about a new technology coming online, maybe within the next 5 years or so, solid state batteries, which they're giving a lot of hope because of the energy density. Is that going to change things significantly, or is that just a marginal increase?
I don't know, but I ever since I've been involved in this discussion, and that has been going on, I've been involved for nearly 40 years. There's always a new technology on the horizon that will solve all the problems that we've been discussing. There's always been some, and they are saying, oh, only 2 or 3 years or 4 years, and we just need subsidies for another 3 years. And then we'll have this new technology that will solve all these problems. And then the new technology comes along and with its own unintended consequences and problems. So I don't know the answer to these new batteries. All I would say is all the batteries we've had until now are causing a lot of problems. And also look at it this way. If you are, a blue-collar worker, you can afford to buy a second-hand car because you've got, enough funds to buy a second-hand car. If you buy a second-hand electric vehicle and you have to replace a battery, that will cost you here in Britain perhaps £8,000. I don't know what it will cost you in the US, but perhaps $8,000. Mm-hmm. Now, that is more expensive than the value of the car itself. So there are all sorts of social implications of going to electric vehicles in terms of who can actually afford to buy an electric vehicle and repair an electric vehicle. These are all problems that no one really has contemplated properly yet.
And on electric vehicles, how about the amount of energy that's going to be needed if we have a large-scale changeover, which it appears they're trying to push? Where's the power coming from?
Good point. Because if we go and electrify our economy and our transport, we will need about 2 or 3 times as much electricity as we're currently generating. And so there is the question, where's that electricity coming from? From wind and solar? I don't think so.
Are there any signs of hope as we go forward here? Any bright lights that we haven't touched on today that give people something to at least have optimism over?
I think I'm afraid it will get worse before it gets better. But in Europe, I think we are reaching a threshold where people are beginning to realize that this utopian project, this utopian plan to basically turn the whole European economy and powered by renewable energy, that is coming basically crashing against reality, crashing with reality, being blown up by the war in Ukraine. I think people are beginning to realize that it's simply unaffordable and perhaps technologically too utopian. But we're not there yet, I'm afraid. We are in a very bad way. I guess it will get much worse in coming years. But there is a growing number of lawmakers now beginning to speak up and speak out, which up until fairly recently they didn't dare because they were afraid of being attacked by the Green campaigners. But they are now speaking up on behalf of their constituents and their voters. And so I guess there will be some readjustment in coming years. As I said, in the US, you are in a much better position because at least you have two parties with two different attitudes and two different positions on these issues, which is always healthier because the public at least know or are forced to think for themselves which position they prefer, whereas here in Europe, we don't have that as yet. But I'm confident the debate will accelerate and there will be some countries which might get it right.
Dr. Peiser, if people would like to follow your work at the Global Warming Policy Foundation online or to be in touch with you, how could they do that?
Well, we have two websites. One is our academic educational research website, which is the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And we have a campaigning arm, which is called Net Zero Watch, which a website which is updated more regularly. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, a free newsletter, if you're interested in developments around the world. We are obviously focused primarily on developments in Europe, but we also cover many other countries, including developing countries, on the whole energy and climate debate.
Dr. Benny Peiser, we appreciate your work very much, and I thank you for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.